Good morning and welcome everyone to the 23rd meeting of the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee in our decision on taking agenda item 4 on draft correspondence in private. Are we all agreed to take item 4 in private? If you are not agreed, indicate in the chat bar. We're all agreed. Our next agenda item is evidence of the sustainability of the newspaper industry and the impact of COVID-19 on print journalism. Can I welcome to the meeting our panel this morning, Joyce McMillan, who is Chair of the National Union of Journalists, Edinburgh Freelance Branch, Dr. Eamon O'Neill, who is the Associate Professor in Journalism at Napier University, and Peter Geoghegan, Chair of the Ferret and Investigations Editor at Open Democracy. I would remind members to give broadcasting staff a few seconds to operate your microphones before beginning to ask your question or indeed to provide an answer, and I would be grateful if questions and answers could be kept as succinct as possible. We'll move straight to questions, and I will begin with the first question and then be followed by Claire Baker. We'll all have 2 questions, and if there's time, I will bring in members at the end for supplementary questions. I'm afraid that's just because of the format of the online meeting. So can I say to the panel, welcome this morning. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your very detailed written submissions, which were very helpful. Can I perhaps start with Joyce McMillan, your submission, Joyce, which I think probably summarises the difficulties that the media is facing specifically in Scotland. You say many of the economic models which used to support the presence of professional journalism in our society are no longer working. And now, with newsagents closed, print newspaper sales plummeting and advertising revenue in freefall, these trends are being dramatically accelerated. And obviously that's a global issue, but you go on to specifically talk about the impacts on Scotland. And I wondered if you would perhaps want to outline them for the purposes of the record of the committee.
Well, I think, the committee, as people who are involved in politics, will be aware of the sort of global pressures on journalism in recent years. The kind of ownership models which used to deliver big profits, which could support a huge range of different journalistic activities, just no longer do that. And you only need to look at the sort of dwindling size and the dwindling range of coverage that Scotland's 2, in inverted commas, national papers, the Herald and the Scotsman, are able to provide, on the basis of a kind of traditional model of ownership. To realise the huge commercial pressures they're under, because we are part of the UK and part of and this would continue with or without independence, we're part of that sort of English-speaking sphere of media. Scottish newspapers face an intensely competitive situation at national level. So at national level, there's a kind of noticeable hollowing out of the business model as our newspapers compete with much larger players on the UK and global scale. At local level, again, as politicians, everyone on the committee will be aware of the changes that have swept through local journalism, of the fact that most local newspapers' traditional titles are now owned by big media players, which again have been through round after round after round of cost cutting in recent decades. With the result that a lot of local newspapers are now not really locally produced at all. They have the masthead remains, but they're kind of hollowed out titles, which are edited and controlled from kind of regional offices, which may be quite a long way away. And the sort of intensity of local coverage that might have existed a generation ago is just no longer there. And there are many studies which demonstrate the consequences of that for kind of accountability, for knowledge of what's going on in the local area, and for people's perceptions of their local area. Because obviously, if you're getting nothing but sort of clickbait, sensational headlines controlled from some office far away, you're not really getting a whole picture of what's going on in your community. But I think most members of the committee will be aware of that. In terms of the specifics of the Scottish situation, I think I've said at national level it's particularly competitive. And I think that has led us into a situation where, we could be teetering towards the sort of Welsh position, where there aren't really strong national media in Scotland, or at least they exist on a relatively small scale, form of weekly magazines, all the rest of it. And of course, media has been absolutely key throughout the whole of the modern era in shaping people's perception of who they are. So, again, independent of the question of whether Scotland is an independent country or not, in the time when newspapers, for instance, were able to generate huge amounts of media, Scotland could have a strong sort of media personality and debate its own affairs through the pages of the Scotsman or the Herald or the Courier or the Press and Journal, with a great sort of sense that there was a community here, that there was a strong tradition of journalism here, that was a tradition of high quality journalism, which then fed into London journalism, where Scots have traditionally played a big role. And the loss of that over the last generation, the loss of that kind of momentum and economic power behind Scottish journalism is something that affects the quality of life here immensely, and people's perception of what Scotland is and what it could be, and of how its debates are being conducted, and also the plurality of that. I mean, of course, we've still got the BBC, but the more voices there can be, the better, obviously. And the BBC has its own issues. So there are specific problems facing Scotland. And what our NUJ branch has been trying to do is to take the NUJ's own recovery plan for the media in the UK and Ireland. The NUJ covers both the UK and Ireland, which was published in April, and to try and work out some specific ways, slight sniffle, specific ways in which we could perhaps, not being over-ambitious given the financial pressures and all the rest of it, but tailor some kind of package at Scottish Government level, which recognises the importance of the media to life in Scotland, and really begins to articulate some ways in which that can be more strongly supported, without obviously the kind of government intervention of which people are extremely wary. So we've made various proposals on that, which members will be able to see in the submission that we've made. And we're hoping that at a modest level, these could begin to provide a focus, not only for some serious assistance to public interest journalism in Scotland, but also for a kind of national debate and awareness of the importance of good journalism in sustaining a community, and of how that can be further developed, through education and various other means, as well as direct support for journalism.
Thanks very much for that, and I'm sure that we'll go into the detail of some of your proposed solutions later on. Can I just turn to Eamon and Peter? Joyce mentioned quality journalism on a number of occasions and its importance, and you've addressed that in your submissions. For the general public out there, how does one distinguish quality journalism from the kind of content that people can access freely on the internet at the moment? Why is it important that we make that distinction?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that it's a bit like the US Supreme Court was famously asked, could they define pornography? And they went away for months and came back with a one-sentence definition. They said, we'll know it when we see it, which made everyone chuckle. And it's a bit like that with good quality journalism. You can tell the difference if you spend enough time in that world. There's essentially raw information, skewed information, biased information, and partial information. You can tell the difference between that and mediated information which has got verifiable sources, which is from reliable places, which in some shape or form has been contextualized, has been weighed carefully. It's been, in a way, there's been some wisdom, there's been some job experience brought here, there's been editorial distance from it, and so on. Now, the problem is that in this day and age, it's okay for people who work in the industry to be able to tell the difference quite easily. but it's not okay for the next generation coming through. The difference is sometimes completely impossible to tell unless you're equipped with those tools. And that, of course, also applies to people, the majority of the population, who are hopping in and out of taxis or going on the underground or going about their business, and they're glancing at the news, and it's difficult for them to tell the difference between what's a good piece of journalism and what's not a good piece of journalism, even in a pluralistic market like what we have in the United Kingdom and indeed in Scotland. It's very difficult for people sometimes to tell the difference between what looks like a piece of journalism and what in actual fact is a piece of propaganda, a piece of biased information by people who are just popping in and out for their own various reasons. So you want to be in a society which is free to ask difficult questions, which is free to hold the powerful to account, which is also about giving a voice to people who don't have a voice, and going back to them and saying, here's what we did, and explaining to them the difference between that and completely unmediated, simply just put a camera somewhere, lock it off, and let people make their own minds up. It's not as simple as that.
Okay. Peter. I wasn't hearing Peter there. Could you start again,
Peter?
Peter?
Is that better? Sorry, I think I might have gone too quickly. I have a tendency to do that. Yeah, I think what was interesting, the phrase that was used both by you, Joan, earlier and by Joyce, was public interest. I think public interest is quite a useful frame for thinking about quality and thinking about the kind of journalism we want to see. And part of that can also be original journalism. Interestingly, actually, at one stage in its recent restructure, the BBC had actually discussed the idea of setting up a little department called original journalism and decided not to, but I think it's quite telling as well, this idea that actually there's a lot of journalism that goes on that is what we might call churnalism. Nick Davies writes about it very well over 15 years ago in his book Flat Earth News. This isn't a new phenomenon. It isn't really even just to do with the internet, and it's a part of journalism that will always exist. It is important for wire service and stuff to put stories out there, and that is important. But as we see in the Scottish press, but in the press more generally, just relying on rewriting wire stories, doesn't add a hell of a lot more to the value of media organisations in terms of public good and public interest, because really they don't add a lot of value in that case because they're just rewriting stories that already exist. But B, it often doesn't serve a lot of public interest because wire organisations and churn stories often will tell the stories that the powerful want to tell, or will often not tell the stories of marginalised people and will not tell stories on the margins. And especially in somewhere like Scotland, which is a smaller context, will often just not tell that many stories full stop. So there's a need for what you want to call public interest journalism, original journalism, and often the only way you can do that, or the start of doing something like that, is through some mark of quality. It's about actually going out and doing original reporting, actually going out and talking to news sources, actually telling stories that haven't been told before. And that's really vital as part of some sort of, it's got two really important functions. One is in terms of bringing stories out and telling things that we wouldn't know about. So one example at the UK level was the Windrush scandal recently. If it wasn't for the journalism of someone like the media gentleman at The Guardian and a newspaper and a platform that wanted to highlight something that's not going to get a huge amount of clicks to start with, that is not the sort of stuff that generates large traffic, at least at the beginning of those sort of stories. So you have to help incentivize people to do that kind of work. That's really important. We can all understand, as anyone who saw the Windrush scandal unfold, has seen some of the documentaries were made about it, these people were treated terribly. But we wouldn't really know about this if it wasn't for the journalism of people like the media gentleman. But also wouldn't have known if it wasn't for publications willing to support that sort of work, knowing that it's not going to get the same mass market appeal as a clickbait headline. So that's one part of it. But the other part of it as well is you need original journalism, quality journalism, to kind of knit together people in some sort of quasi-national conversation at whatever level it is. The importance of journalism as a tool to tell stories that will kind of bridge, without being too cliched about it, bridge divides, let people understand and see common worlds between themselves. And I think we're getting to a point in Scotland where we don't have as much of that content as we had 15 or 20 years ago. We really nowhere near enough of it, especially in print and online. And that, I think, makes it harder and harder for people to see shared lived experiences. And some of that, and I think that's a really, really important thing. It's about helping, say I'm the chair of the Ferret. We do a lot of stuff. We'll do a lot of stories on marginalised communities, whether it's the homeless, whether it's people, asylum seekers, people like that. And we only really, those stories only often come up as a big national story when something terrible happens, like happened in Glasgow during the summer. But it's so important to have reporters like we have telling those stories in the run-up so you can actually understand it. And it meant at least when some of those stories happen, there's context there that people can then understand, so it doesn't just happen in a a vacuum. And if we hadn't been there, if others like us hadn't been there, that the tragedies happening in Glasgow in the summer would have just been easily reported without any context whatsoever of the history on issues around asylum seeking in Glasgow. And that's just one example. So I think there's a series of reasons about why quality journalism needs to be embedded and supported, and why it doesn't always make sense for news organisations in straitened times with straitened bottom lines and shareholders looking for quick returns, as is always the case, to do that.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. I now pass on to Claire Baker, the Deputy Convener.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for the panellists this morning. The panellists have set out a picture of the importance of journalism, but also the fragility of the system at the moment. And I was wondering if the panel would want to comment on the current situation as we live through the COVID pandemic, and whether that has had an impact on what was already a system that was quite fragile, and where do you have any concerns about how long the COVID pandemic will last and what kind of impact that will have on the sector? Joyce, would you like to go first?
Me, yes. Okay. Well, I think our observation of that has been very much that it's been patchy. I mean, the submission that we sent in was sent in May, and I think, to be honest, the picture which has emerged since May has been a bit less one of complete gloom than some media were anticipating at the time. I mean, the Johnson press was just sort of making across the board pay cuts and all the rest of it in anticipation of tremendous trouble. So in that sense, I think some areas of advertising revenue, particularly to do with the areas that we all know have done well in the pandemic, such as, sort of various forms of sort of online and delivery fees, have actually held up better than was anticipated. But I think listening to what's being said by our staff at the NUJ office in Glasgow, who I know have given evidence to this committee before and could probably give you more detail on this, I think the great fear is that once the winter sets in, once the furlough support that many advertisers and so on have enjoyed begins to fade away, then there will be another round of sort of mass redundancies among Scottish journalists. These are already being planned and discussed. The union's already in there trying to negotiate the terms of them. And, given how stripped down and how short of staff compared with a couple of decades ago, most journalistic operations in Scotland are, the prospect of another round of redundancies this winter is a particularly alarming one. And also, just in terms of the sort of situation we're facing, the idea of having less journalism and less investment in journalism rather than more is really quite a frightening one in this circumstance. So I think, in one sense, some areas of advertising revenue have held up better than was hoped, but in another sense, there is every sign that most of the big players in commercial journalism are going to be using this opportunity to make yet more redundancies, which is, a really frightening prospect in terms of the quality and range of Scottish journalism.
Thank you, Joyce. I'd maybe be interested in Peter's comments, given that it operates a different model, and whether there's been an impact to the kind of work that you're able to undertake.
Yes. So unlike kind of traditional newspapers, or we are moving towards it, the Ferret is a member-owned cooperative with over 1,600 paying members. So what that means is everybody who joins the Ferret gets a stake in the Ferret, and our journalism is supported both by paying members and philanthropic grants, and some of our journalism is also supported by tie-ins with newspapers. So there's an element in which we are vulnerable to changes in the newspaper industry, both in terms of like being able to collaborate for financially with traditional media outlets, but also there is that issue where if people's incomes in general are being squeezed, it makes it more difficult for organisations like the Ferret and Open Democracy, who I work for as well, to bring in revenue from subscribers. So there is always going to be an element of that. But at the same time, I do think we are seeing, like, quite a lot of newspaper magazines, and even also the Ferret, have actually quite happily not seen a huge trail off in the number of people who are donating to us, despite the more difficult economic climate. So I think that partly reflects there is also a bit of a mood, or at least you've seen it actually in some newspapers. Like there's a very interesting model in one of the Swedish newspapers. Circulation's got up about 25%, and subscription rates got up about 25%. And actually, quite a lot of paywall newspapers have actually had an uptick in sales. The problem is actually that advertising has gone down. So I think people do want, I think, quality journalism and quality media they can trust more than ever in the current climate, where there's a lot of, there still is a lot of conspiracy thinking going on. There's a lot of, falsehood spread on misinformation and disinformation. So I do think readers do want sources of information they can really trust. The challenge is that the existing architecture of for-profit journalism based on advertising isn't sustaining it. It doesn't sustain it anymore. So for people like the Ferret and Open Democracy, I think we've seen we haven't grown massively as much as we'd like in this period, but we haven't retrenched because a lot of our funding is already baked in for the longer term. I guess the concern for us is that, as people's income becomes more stretched, how will that affect us? But also, we rely on philanthropic grants as well to help with our funding. What will happen to philanthropic organisations, if we go into a real bear market, if we see the type of global recession we saw in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis? That will make it more difficult. And that's one of the reasons I talk in my submission about the importance of making journalism, public interest journalism, a charitable good, which is quite a free thing Scotland could do, and it would echo other countries like America, and it would make it much easier for new organisations or not-for-profit organisations like the Ferret, our community-owned newspapers, to be much more sustainable, because charitable status is actually very important for a lot of funders, and it has other advantages that we currently can't access, and I think that would be very helpful.
Thank you. As a second question, as a follow-on to that, and maybe Eamon wants to talk about the importance of advertising revenue. Both the previous speakers have talked about the decline in advertising revenue during this period. Is that the model, and Peter's talked about a different type of model. Where do you think journalism, if it's to be sustainable in Scotland, should be heading? And who, in terms of advertising revenue, is there a bigger, I've put some written questions down about government spending, and obviously at the moment we're in a pandemic, so there's a public health message to get out there. Where do you think the role of the private sector and government sit in terms of advertising?
Well, I think that the first thing is, if they would commit to actually advertise in some of the more needy papers and publishing groups that are actually trying to innovate and trying to come up with a new way of doing business, that would be helpful. First of all, to ring fence where they advertise, to be committed to the local press and certain government adverts and so on, which sometimes can disappear down rabbit holes. They should put them in strategically aimed places. But I would just want to go back, just if I may, to some of the points there that both Joyce and Peter raised. One of the things that's often not looked at is the fact that there are newspapers right now in the most difficult of markets which are doing really well. For example, the New York Times is a company which completely turned itself around in the last 5 to 6 years. They published a report in 2014. It was leaked to me before it was actually made public, and it was called the Innovation Report, which they generated internally, where they really looked at themselves in a hard way and said, we need to change. We need to turn this battleship round in the ocean fast, or we're going down the tubes. And they did that, and they did it very well, and they've gone into very good profits with the subscription model. They have a loyal and growing readership. And a lot of it is based around the 2 points that both Joyce and Peter made, and which I was alluding to in my opening statement, which was the notion of original journalism, investigative journalism, public interest journalism. That's what people want. We're in a very strange position right now, where a nation like Scotland, which has got an incredibly engaged, critical thinking, and news consuming audience, are not being given a product which they will buy. All the evidence shows, you've heard from Peter about the Ferret, and you've heard from Joyce saying there are some glimmers of light on the horizon. All the evidence shows that in a peculiar way, people during periods like this are really, really crying out for hardcore, verifiable, real information, really good journalism, in other words. And in Scotland, as in other parts of the country as well, but in Scotland in particular, ever since the independence debate, there's been a rise in the whole notion of being a critically engaged consumer audience. They will take it. They will take the journalism if it's available, and they will pay for it. That's why, even at the moment, although the BBC's been going through a continuing difficult period, the people still stay by and large fairly loyal, although there are warning signs that the licence fee payment is going down, particularly in Scotland. So what I would actually suggest to the panel is that you really, or the committee, is that you really stop and think about where the responsibility lies for this happening. I would say, from my research and my experience, it lies with the publishers. Now, you tell me one publisher in Scotland which produced the equivalent of what they did in New York in 2014. There are none. None of them actually saw it coming, except if you take a slightly more jaded point of view and say they did see it coming. And what they did was they saw one model to actually go back into profit, which was to cut jobs, which is like a restaurant opening, advertising fantastic food, then changing hands and keep thinning out the menu and hoping the customers won't notice. Of course they notice. That's why the hardcore audience will go to organisations like the Ferret, or they will subscribe to podcast I do weekly with Top Media and hundreds of thousands. They'll go and listen to that even globally because they know quality when they see it. The publishers did not actually provide the means for the journalists to stop and think and chart their own course. They tried to chart it for them, and strangely enough, it's the frontline staff which are taking it in the neck. The publishers seem to disappear, quite handsome bonuses and retirement packages. That's where some of the blame lies, but it's not just looking back. But at least if you take a genuine, measured view of what happened and copy the models where there's been successful, we can avoid what's coming. And I'm warning right now what's coming, which there's going to be news deserts. There's going to be parts of Scotland where you're not going to be fed by any local news. You're not going to have a generation coming up who understands what journalism is compared to what they're looking in TikTok videos, and they're going to vote and act as citizens accordingly, which is uninformed, not engaged, and completely unaware of what it means to be a sentient citizen in a democracy. I'm sorry.
Thank you, convener. That's my questions finished.
Thank you. Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, convener, and good morning, colleagues, and to our panel. I'm just actually, it's just queued me up nicely, just picking up on Eamon McNeill's last sentence there, where he said that there was a danger, a risk of a generation coming up that does not know what journalism is. And I wanted to focus my couple of questions on the issue of the younger generations and their interest or lack thereof in certainly traditional journalism, newspapers, and what our witnesses can feel about that in terms of what they suggest could be done to interest younger generations in being readers of their material. Perhaps I could start with Joyce.
Yes, well, I think as journalists, the slogan of the NUJ throughout the whole of the last sort of 30 years in this sort of area has been journalism matters. It's not newspapers matter. It's not the BBC matters. It's not, it's not the particular medium that journalists care about. What we care about is finding a model that enables professional journalists to do their job, to have the time to do their job in some depth and properly, and to be paid for it. There's an awful lot of free journalism going on now, particularly at the hyper-local and local level, where people are kind of holding community journalism together by depending on volunteers. And of course, that in itself has an impact on who can afford to do it, who's got the time to do it, and the kind of perspective that those demographics are likely to have. So, our priority is to find and produce good quality, paid for journalism. We don't mind which platform it appears on. Some publications, like notoriously Private Eye, are very successful in maintaining print. A lot of people still like and enjoy print. Other publications have very successfully moved to kind of major online operations and are now making most of their income from online subscriptions and so on. So we need to be aware of all these models, but we need to be aware of how young people tend towards the more online models. And we need to make sure that whatever platform they are using to access news, that this debate and this sense that there is a choice between just nonsense and clickbait and pictures of skateboarding kittens or whatever, or the latest bit of celebrity gossip on one hand, and on the other hand, actual thoroughly researched, well-presented news about the real political realities of the communities you're living in at every level, whether that's your local community, whether it's Scotland, whether it's the wider UK or Europe. So, the important thing is to focus on developing people's critical understanding, not of what any particular medium is, but of what journalism itself is. And I think Eamon can talk more eloquently about this because he teaches journalism. But I think the worry is that you've got young people now even young people who want to be journalists, who actually have a very limited experience and limited perception of the possibilities of journalism and of that critical difference between really thorough journalism, which helps and supports a political community or any kind of community in making good decisions, and journalism, which is basically just about generating clicks, which is, the main currency of modern journalism, really. So, we've got various proposals in our little list which might contribute to that. One is the idea that there should be some focal point for all of these debates in Scotland, a foundation for public interest journalism, which, however it is funded, and it could be funded from many different sources, actually becomes a focal point for education, for debate, for understanding of these issues, and for supporting new initiatives which really contribute to the future of journalism in Scotland. And of course, it would be bound to have a focus on the rising generation, because if you don't have a new generation of consumers, then you don't have a media industry. The other suggestion we've got that is specific to young people is that the Scottish Government and supported by the Parliament might consider the idea of some kind of voucher scheme for young people aged maybe 16 to 19, so they're at that sort of age where they're just leaving school, that are still in school in the early part of the period, so it can be sort of linked to the sort of critical understanding of the media elements of the curriculum for excellence. And to give them the power to actually act as active consumers of media, and then to link that to an education programme which would make them more aware of the types of media into which they could invest their vouchers, of the importance of the decisions they make about that for the future of the various communities in which they live. So that would be one way, it's one idea that might work as a way of kind of focusing education of young people in that sort of age group about their role as consumers of media and about how that links to their wider role as citizens and voters.
Thank you for that very interesting suggestion, which obviously we'll reflect on. I think the key sort of overarching comment I took from Joyce's contribution was that journalism matters irrespective of the platform, and perhaps I could turn to Peter for his comments on the general issue.
Yeah, I think there's often a tendency that when we talk about journalism, we just look at the established media outlets, and we think about newspapers, we think about online, and we think about broadcast, we think about them all as being quite separate. And what we really have now in 2020 is real convergence. And I think traditionally, if you look at something like kind of attempts to help the newspaper industry or the journalism industry, it's often focused just on newspapers and focused on legacy media outlets and seeing them as somehow distinct from other outlets. So if you look at the BBC Reporter scheme, the local democracy reporter scheme that was brought in by the Westminster government about the guts of 10 years ago, and the idea was to take off the top slice some of the licence fee and give it to media outlets to employ journalists, because there was a sense that an awareness that we weren't seeing this public interest journalism, that stories that needed to be told weren't being told. And what we can see largely has happened with that is that newspapers use that, unsurprisingly, because they are a lot of them publicly listed companies, to shore up their bottom line, to allow them to continue to make the kind of cuts Eamon mentioned, and to continue this kind of strategy of really squeezing their assets, because that's what a lot of, unfortunately, especially in Scotland, the big newspaper owning the two big titles, the Scotsman Herald, are both owned by organisations that basically that is their strategy, is an asset squeezing strategy. And what that has meant is that there hasn't been, I think, the kind of interventions that I think would have really helped the industry, would have helped to promote the kind of journalism I think we're all talking about today, quality journalism, public interest journalism. I think the kind of things that Joyce mentions about kind of a public interest news initiative. I think there's a number of things that can be done. I think any interventions or any ideas around kind of trying to help the newspaper industry and the wider journalism sector needs to kind of take a much more platform neutral view. I think it needs to move away from this idea that there's newspapers that need to be helped and there's digital platforms which are somehow distinct, because that's not the case anymore. So we can all see that. I also think there's a need to try and talk about plurality of voices and plurality of models and ownership. But I think moving away from just seeing kind of large companies and large newspaper groups as the only people that you want to help, I think there's a real need to engage, because we're seeing there's more opportunities now for local ownership of newspaper organisations. And we're seeing this is happening across the world. There's a huge move into not-for-profit journalism, because what you have at the moment is this juncture that there is people out there who want to pay for journalism, and journalism can be profitable. All these newspapers that we're talking about, they are losing staff, but they are still profitable. That's why people own them and they're trying to squeeze them. But the problem is they've got large legacy costs and also shareholders who want returns. When you strip away the legacy costs, but also the shareholder aspect of it, there is we've seen a lot of this happening in America in particular, but across Europe, but it just hasn't really happened in Britain and Ireland, is that when you strip that away, there is an opportunity to make really vibrant news organisations that are not for profit. I think there's a real need to kind of think about that, and also to think about ownership and to think about local ownership, and to promote local ownership of media and to bring media much more down into a local level. And I think that what's interesting now for Scotland to talk about this is there is an opportunity, I think, for the Scottish Government to carve out a more distinct media policy from what you have in Westminster. There's a lot of tools that are available there, a lot of which don't cost a huge amount of money, to try and engage, to try and kind of broaden and make a much more plural media landscape than we have at the present. I think shifting the way we all think about this. And I come from a traditional journalism background. I worked in newspapers, I worked for Channel 4. Now I work in what might be called the not-for-profit journalism world. And I've seen both sides of the coin, and I think there is a lot of opportunities for growth and development in that. And also, and I think they're at the moment not being realised.
Thank you, Peter, for that contribution. It's very interesting, and I particularly focused on your suggestion that we should be looking at a distinct policy offering in Scotland, obviously subject to the constraints we're under, but that you feel there still would be scope to do quite a bit there. And just turning lastly to Eamon, I mean, I take the public interest bit. I'm a politician, my bread and butter, but equally, I think we should make a pitch also for columnists, opinion writers. I mean, I love reading, for example, Fidelma Cook, and I just wanted to mention her. I think she's a fantastic journalist, and I have loved reading her pieces in the Herald magazine on a Saturday. I think they're just fantastic, and I don't think we want to lose that element of journalism as well. But turning to Eamon, and if Eamon could respond to the general issue, but also when responding, if he could touch briefly, given his position, on where we are, the other side of this, are young people still seeking to study journalism? What's the kind of experience there? So over to Eamon, thank you.
Well, the short answer would be absolutely yes. I mean, we have at Edinburgh Napier University, which is one of the top universities in the United Kingdom, for teaching journalism going back decades. We have queues of them every spring applying, and we have to reject quite a number of them. And very good candidates. So the answer to your question is yes, there is a definite hunger amongst every generation to want to go into the business. One of the interesting things that I do every year in the first class that I have is that I ask them, how many people today in the class, first year, bought a newspaper? No hands go up, none. The notion of there's a trend towards getting their information online is actually quite funny. That trend has been about 10 years old. The first ones that did that are now heading to high school. So an idea of convergence happened a decade ago. It's just that in Scotland, their publishers were so far behind. I always find it very strange that when I meet the publishers, they have the latest sat-nav on their cars and the latest iPhone 11s, but the offices where they actually get the money from to pay for all those is still acting as if it's back in the 1950s. There's a strange sort of difference between what they practice and what they preach. The other thing I would say is, as far as the sort of voucher idea goes, that's something I tabled in the submission. I think, as Joyce said, combining it with the curriculum for excellence is an excellent opportunity. I've got twin 12-year-old boys who just started high school in People a month ago, and I think it would be a great opportunity for them, notwithstanding who their dad is, for them to be exposed to who the local journalists are, to know what local newspapers are, to understand how it differs from other types of information. I remember years ago, politicians had to lead the way with the smoking ban and with the seatbelt ban, both of which were framed as our right to choose. And there came a point that politicians correctly said, no, there actually is a public health problem, we need to sort this out. And it's exactly the same with this. We live in a very, very complex democratic society where you've got burgeoning businesses in Dundee and Edinburgh, which are at the forefront of digital innovation, and yet our newspapers are at the other end. They could use that innovation to also be at the forefront of actually saving jobs and building new jobs in the future. And we also, at some point as well, we need to think about exactly how the government can support this in a way which also allows them wriggle room, because I appreciate you're all politicians. I'm sure the journalists are not, apart from Fidel Macouk, who everyone loves, is not exactly at the top of your hit parade when it comes to great friends. But on the other hand, we all recognise we need each other in a sort of healthy democracy. But I think at the minute, I think this is a great sign what we're doing this morning, because we're actually starting to move towards treating journalism as a national asset and something to be prioritised and really valued. And here's why it's important, because the reality is, if I go back to that scene in the classroom, that's a bunch of kids who want to go into journalism, be journalists. They see all the problems, they see the cutbacks, and let God help them, they still want to do it. And yet, where are they getting the majority of their information from? They go through Facebook and Twitter, they go through the portal. Now, who controls Facebook? The algorithms. How do they work? No one knows. The ex-editor of The Guardian, Alan Rusbridger, entered into a deal with Facebook so The Guardian could get more hits on their website. And he said later on, it was a black box. We didn't know how it worked. So if you've got an organisation like that, which in a moment constitutes the largest place that people begin their search every morning for information. They don't go to the Daily Record, they don't go to the Herald, they don't go to the Scotsman, they don't go to the Guardian, they don't go to the Daily Mail. They do that later on in the day. But first thing in the morning, they all go to Twitter and Facebook. How much control have we got over them? How much control can the Scottish Parliament oversight have over them? And when everybody's outraged at the fact Donald Trump only paid $750 in tax, how much did Amazon pay? How much does Facebook pay? So that's the problem. You're actually looking in the wrong place. The place where the influence is right now is with these gigantic digital companies, these huge platforms. That's where the current generation and the next generation are getting all their information from. The way to actually act as a work against that is to look at these proposals we are putting in place. The first thing is get the next generation. If this generation in some ways are gone, get the next generation and get them sized up and put seatbelts in place, stop the smoking as well, and make them realise that journalism is a huge part of actually being a fully thinking citizen in a democracy. Scotland could lead on this.
Very inspiring words, and again, lots for the committee to think about. I think indeed, I know another colleague is wanting to focus on social media platforms in particular, so thank you very much indeed, and thank you, convener.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. We now move to Ross Greer.
Thank you, convener. I should start off with a brief declaration of interest in that I still retain my membership of the NUJ and I'm a paying member of the Ferret as well. As Annabelle Ewing said, I'm particularly interested in the role of the social media platforms and everything that Eamon's just said. Before we come to that, I'd like to stick with the issue of young people and their consumption of the media. This point around media education seems quite right. But if we're talking about the points that have been made around disinformation and the spreading of conspiracy theories, from both my anecdotal experience and also the studies I've read on this, which are largely American, it's not people my age and younger who are driving conspiracy theories. It's people who are middle-aged and older who were regular consumers of traditional print media and for a variety of reasons either no longer are or simultaneously still are and are helping to spread these conspiracy theories. So media education focused solely on young people doesn't quite do it. But I'm interested in the panel's views on what traditional media platforms offer young people, because it's not just hard news. Hard news is something that young people want, but if I look across the Scottish media landscape, I can think of almost no columnists who are under the age of 30. I can think of almost no one who's got the generational experiences of my generation in terms of precarious housing, precarious work. Who are the people who look and sound like them? So I'd be interested in your thoughts on what offering the traditional media landscape, what offering our newspapers need to actually make to young people, beyond just the hard news. And I said that is the primary role here, absolutely. I'd be interested in your thoughts on having a media that actually looks like the generation that it needs to get buy-in from if it's to survive.
I think in theory, Ross, and there is a difference between theory and practice here, because you're right. In practice, a lot of the people who are writing wider coverage for our traditional media are in an older age group. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But one of the things that I do think is important about traditional media, and which has not been very well captured in online media, is its power to attract people across subject areas. Serendipity effect of reading a newspaper, that you're flicking through it, you think you're looking for a news story, but you find Fidel McCook's column, so that kind of aspect of it is very interesting to me, particularly as an arts journalist. I mean, for the last 40 years almost, by some miracle, I've been a theatre critic in Scotland, and the power of newspapers to finance any kind of critical analysis of what's going on in our cultural scene has been dwindling and dwindling throughout that time. So the number of colleagues I've got has kind of dwindled away. And it does seem to me that that kind of cultural coverage, for instance, is one area where young people can actually be very drawn to media of any kind. I mean, if you're really actively pursuing and looking for what's going on in the new, in the Scottish independent music scene, if it ever recovers from COVID, or, in other areas of sort of cultural life that mean a lot to young people, if you're providing, strong reviews and information about that from a Scottish perspective, then for young people living in Scotland, that is going to be attractive. So I think one of the things that will attract young people to coverage is not only having a younger generation of journalists involved and writing, it's also writing about the kind of wide range of subjects that young people are interested in. And I think particularly cultural coverage is very, very important to young people, and critical coverage of the cultural phenomena that they enjoy, is really, really important. And it's an area of debate that often gets very much to the heart of the worldview of any particular generation of young people as they're coming through. So I think one of the things that we could really be debating in the context of some kind of Scottish initiative on the future of journalism would be how we retain that sort of range of coverage. If you imagine a kind of traditional Scotsman-style newspaper a generation or two ago, it would have had, a full-time education correspondent, a full-time agriculture correspondent, several people writing about culture, a full-time arts editor, a full-time books editor. It would have had a huge range of specialist fields that would have attracted in a whole lot of different people, including young people, to begin to read the newspaper. And now that we're dealing, of course, with a vastly different, more varied range of platforms, I think it's quite interesting to discuss how we can retain that sort of range of coverage, including coverage that really looks at the concerns of young people.
Thanks, Joyce. Be interested in Eamon or Peter's thoughts on this, about the offering that's actually made to young people?
To add into this, and actually to echo some of Ross's points, I gave a talk a couple of years ago at a college in the south side of Glasgow, and I introduced myself as coming from the Ferret. A kind of room of about 40 or 50 people who were interested in journalism, most of whom hadn't heard of the Ferret. And our profile does also skew older, and I think I think Ross does pick up an important point. But when it comes to monetising journalism, the the money side of it is older. And okay, part of that is because older people have more disposable income and they've had asset bubbles and all the rest of it. But also there's a cultural thing about paying for journalism. I think there's also a cultural thing that I think the Scottish industry in general hasn't got to grips with, which is people want to see themselves reflected in the journalism they consume. And in Scotland, I think it's particularly difficult because you have this older cohort who you know are your subscribers, which isn't so much the case with the Fair. We do actually have small amounts of money available for young journalists, and we do try and encourage young journalists in. We have young journalists on the board. But if you're a traditional publisher, you're the people who are consuming your content are older, so you end up in that you're constantly trying to keep them there. So you are producing more and more content that skews older. I think it's not just columnists. I think there's in terms of what the kind of stuff that younger people consume. We still have very traditional ways of telling stories in Scotland. Here's a newspaper story online. There's very little video, there's very little integrated content, and there's very little high quality content. I think we come back to this question of quality, because what we have seen, the internet has Americanized and flattened difference across the world, and particularly in the English speaking world. And it's one of the particular problems I think that smaller outlets face in Britain, is that we all speak English, so we can consume content from America. So, it's one of the reasons why cultural phenomenon, whether it's Black Lives Matter or television shows from America, can become really big thousands of miles away, because we're consuming the same content. It's made very well. It's very high quality. It's very good. It's very compelling. And often the offerings that are similar in a local level are just nowhere near they're not good enough. And so the medium is a really important part of this. So if you have young people, you're not going to get young people to start buying newspapers. And you have to go and meet consumers where they're at. So at the Fair, we do have things like, a Snapchat channel and all that, and that is important. But I think there's almost a need to go even further. And again, part of that as well, I think, is when you're bringing new journalists in. A lot of younger journalists, your entry-level job, say in a Scottish newsroom, and I know this from experience, is churning, as we'll say, is churning out 4 or 5 stories a day, is rewriting copy from the internet. Which is not something that's going to particularly appeal to people of your age group. It's not necessarily the content that you would produce. So we're not empowering younger journalists with experienced editors to produce the kind of content that they would want to see. And some outlets do this well. I think The Guardian's been good on this, but we don't really seem to do that. So I think that's part of it too. And also I think what's happened in Scotland is, and Ross, and we've all talked about this at some stage, we've had a lot of people interested in politics, a lot of people interested in political debate, but the balance between the power of politics and the power of the media, I think, has been incredibly weighted, which at times has always been a bit of a seesaw, has become incredibly weighted towards politics. And what I mean by that is, say in the wake of the 2014 referendum, a lot of the kind of people that you saw doing interesting stuff on the edges of media, on the edges of the independence referendum, ended up working for political parties or working for the government in the aftermath, because the government and political parties had money to pay for them, which traditional media didn't have, I think, the foresight to think about how do we bring these new voices in. I think it's a pretty damning indictment that 6 years on from the independence referendum, in which so many people like me, who even wrote a book about this, talked about this kind of new young voices coming through, that we have almost no new voices or young voices at all in the Scottish media landscape.
Thanks very much. I'm conscious of time, so I'm wondering just if Eamon wants to reflect on any of these points, but I'm going to roll up a second question specifically to him, picking up this issue of social media regulation. Part of the challenge with that seems to be social media platforms are treated like a kind of lawful neutral, that they are just a platform that provides other people's content rather than regulated in anything like the same way as a media organisation, a newspaper, etc. Would be. But the challenge here is that they're massive international corporations who can bully individual nations into avoiding regulating them, or who by the nature of their platform are impossible to regulate at a national level. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. How in a Scottish context can we take on the incredible power of these massive corporations, because they are dictating to a huge extent what the media landscape looks like now and what it's going to look like 10, 20, 30 years from now?
The answer actually is horrifically simple. You just show how rubbish their journalism offerings are. Scottish young kids are bright. They've the potential to lead the world in any field that they go into. Why would they not be able to understand the qualitative difference between a load of old codswallop on Facebook and a piece of good Scottish journalism? It's fairly straightforward. If they're spending all day looking at Facebook and flicking through things and thinking that's where the news is, then the problem is they don't have a choice. They don't have an alternative for all the reasons Peter and Joyce have just alluded to, and I've been talking about with disinvestment, asset stripping and everything else. The reason you don't see any young voices is because, as Joyce was also alluding to, the jobs aren't there. If you just by statistics, not jobs for anyone, that means you're also going to struggle with the next generation. I mean, I should give an honourable mention here to the BBC. We often take a kicking from everybody, and sometimes I contribute to that. But they actually are fairly good when it comes to their BBC graduate recruitment programme. They try, and they do also go out in a positive way, look at the recruitment of people from different ethnic backgrounds, different genders and so on. They go out their way to do this in a positive and discriminating way. But it's interesting that when you talk about Facebook, look, in reality, they are a publisher. They enjoy all the privileges of being a publisher, but they don't have any of the other responsibilities. Anybody else that's an editor of a newspaper has got to hang their reputation around every story that's published, whether it's a column, whether it's a sports report, whether it's a cultural review, or whether it's a hard-hitting piece of public interest journalism on the front page. But if you've got somebody who's just running the whole show by an algorithm and tailoring it to you in a bespoke way, then what happens is you end up with a lot of selfish consumers who think that they only should get the news that suits them. That's dangerous.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Have you finished your questions, Ross?
I've got more questions, but I'm conscious of time, and I'd be happy to come back with them later.
I'll try to bring you back in later. I'll try to bring you back in later. Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel and colleagues. Before I start, could I bring the committee's attention, please, to the fact that members of my family own Shetland's only weekly print newspaper, but I have no interest in it, financial or otherwise. And so you'll not be surprised that I think local newspapers make a valuable contribution to the economic and social life of the communities. And they are a reliable source of information, and people have turned to them, obviously, during this public health pandemic. But how, in going forward, given the comprehensive cover of local news, social events, councils, courts, how, going forward, can local newspapers support a team of journalists to provide such information? And that's to any member of the panel who wishes to answer.
I'll start on that. It seems to me that looking forward, the experience of trying to run local newspapers on a purely commercial basis, it may work in some communities, and we certainly need to have a kind of horses for courses approach to it. But I think in terms of being owned by big sort of publicly quoted companies, there's a lot of evidence that that model for providing local news is beginning to fail. Being owned by a sort of family-owned companies is a sort of different matter, that have more of a local identity, that are not seeing it primarily as a way of generating sort of stock market level media profits. And then there are all of the other models of sort of public interest ownership that have recurred during this discussion. And it seems to me that one thing that the Scottish Government really could do, perhaps without spending any money of its own, or certainly with spending very little money of its own, would be to have a really thorough sort of reboot of the various mechanisms that there are for supporting local not-for-profit enterprises, to make sure that that covers potential media organisations. The situation where a local title which has a long history is all but dead, and a community might want to buy it out in the same way that it might buy out the pub or the local shop if that was being abandoned by bigger owners. The situation in which a community wants to start up a local newspaper of its own. I think it would be really useful if the Scottish Government, with the support of MSPs, was to have a really thorough re-examination of all its mechanisms for supporting those kind of community initiatives, so that journalism becomes considered as a public community good that can be supported in those terms, perhaps by some kind of modification of the Community Empowerment Act to make that role in supporting local news and local information for communities a bit clearer. There are various ways, I think, in which the Scottish Government could act to support local news without intervening, obviously, in any kind of ownership or editorial process, by providing a stronger legal framework, by setting up an institution that could provide sort of initial grants to such initiatives, partly with government funding perhaps, but also with funding from a range of sources, and also just by creating a kind of presumption that the Scottish Government is very much interested in supporting public interest news, and that it's interested in doing that at the local level as well as the national level, and that all of its sort of regulations in that area will be framed in such a way as to support those initiatives as well as possible. And that could also help to give a brighter future, I think, to existing local newspapers, which have a strong local root and are operated locally, as well as to supporting new initiatives.
Thank you. Does Peter want to respond to that, please?
Yes, I'm happy to speak to that too. I think that's really the kind of nub of it, is that what you have is large amount of local need. I think local newspapers, we all realise, are very important. If you live in, I'm from a rural area, how important the local newspaper was in terms of both not just community, but doing a series of really important jobs like both reflecting the community back to itself, but also doing stuff like holding the council to account, kind of providing a forum for information, for accurate information. And I think we all can see the benefit and the value of it. We can see what's happened. They're called news deserts. They've been written a lot about in the American context, but I think you could probably write about them in the British context too, in the Scottish context, where what happens is newspapers disappear and people do not have access to reliable local information. And in that world, they do get replaced by, I think this keys in with some of the previous points about social media, because then what happens is, in the absence of reliable information and in the absence of local newspapers, social media platforms become the place where that information circulates and can often be filled with misinformation and disinformation and all the problems that go with that. And I think we have some interesting examples in Scotland, places like the West Highland Free Press, where we have seen community ownership for newspapers. It's difficult, it's very difficult. I think there's a need again to facilitate that. And we have some places where it sounds like in Shetland, where you have family-owned newspapers, which tend to be a bit more resilient as well. But the big problem is in a lot of areas, what you're seeing is local newspapers, which could operate often quite well, or there's a case you made for experimenting with them as not-for-profits, are expected to deliver returns, deliver shareholder value, and they're not capable of doing that because they're not able to. So what happens is they get cut further and further. And I think the difficulty I think now is we're talking about 12, 15 years of cuts now. So 12 or 15 years ago, people could see a lot more value in their local newspapers. And it's actually, I always find that whenever I go anywhere, I buy a newspaper. And the variability, I'm sure almost everybody on this call has experienced just how variable in terms of quality local newspapers can be. From very good and very interesting and very informative to very thin. And that's that kind of, that's a process of cutting. And it's kind of, I think, cut away the community and the readers from the local newspaper. And I think there's a real need to try and look at ways to support newspapers to make a transition from being for-profit outlets into not-for-profit outlets, and from being multinationally owned to being locally owned. I think there is models for how to do that. It takes time and it takes creativity, but I think there's a need to try and think about that and how to support that.
Thank you. And just my last question, if I can maybe start with Eamon, if there is support for local the newspapers in general, if there's support coming from government, how do you ensure that there remains editorial independence?
Well, I think the what you do is you build into your plans a firewall. It's been done in other parts of the world, where you set up the fund, you set up the initiative, you set up the panel that runs it, and you make sure that there's absolutely no chance that anyone who's receiving that help can see themselves as being in any way compromised. I mean, look, at the end of the day, if you make something attractive to people, they will get involved in it. I'm always struck by the fact that if you go on a train or you sometimes go to a lounge somewhere, there's free copies of the Scotsman kicking around, bulk copies that are lying there for people of a certain demographic to just grab and read on the train or whatever. They're just lying around and they're given away. Yet you go and sit outside a high school at lunchtime and there's no kids walking out with a paper. They're all looking at their handheld devices. So there's no point in saying to them, buy a newspaper. That's like saying, eat your broccoli. Great idea. But in reality, they're not going to do it unless you make it quite attractive and interesting. Now, I'm down in the borders. I'm down near people. And we've got a thriving local newspaper and the Peopleshire News. And it does very well. It's got young journalists on it. It covers all the stuff you would expect. There's plenty of photographs of the Bonnie Baby competition and here's an interesting sheep and things like that. But on the other hand, it gives some good hard-hitting news. The journalists are engaged, they're out in the street, they're talking to people. And here's the other thing. They have got a fantastic presence online. They've not only got their own website, but the first place they go is they're on Facebook. So if there's a bad crash up at the local junction, or there's a helicopter doing the rounds, you've only to go on your phone straight away, and you can see what the Peopleshire News reporters are already churning over on their website or on the Facebook page. That's where the future is. Go where the kids already are. In the old days, what you could do was actually sit back and wait for everybody to come to you. Now you've got to go to the watering holes and the places where they already are. And here's the really good thing about it. We know how to reach them. They've already got the things which traditional legacy journalists and publishers sometimes see as the enemy, which is a digital device. That's wrong. That's the opportunity because they're already connected. It's just as Peter says, they're going to the wrong places for their information because of the fact that there's nothing there for them available locally or nationally. None of the newspapers are reaching out. They're reaching out to people they think they've got money and so on, but they're not reaching out to the next generation. You know, it's that notion of, what was it, somebody once said to John F. Kennedy, why should we plant a tree? It'll take 100 years. And he said, well, you better hurry up and plant it then. That's what I'm saying now. We should engage with the younger people, both at primary school, high school, and even at universities, and get in there aggressively with the papers, helping them as well. And if you plant that seed, trust me, it will bear fruit. At the moment, people cross the desert on their hands and knees and across broken glass to get information. It's just that when they get there, the information turns out to be absolute rubbish and dangerous stuff from marginal groups who are way ahead technologically than what we are doing at the moment in Scotland.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. And I'll now go to Oliver Mandel.
Thank you, Convener. I absolutely love my local paper. There are lots of good journalists across the constituency I'm proud to represent, but the Dumfriesshire newspaper group that produces the Moffat News, Annandale Herald, Dumfries Courier, and the Annandale Observer, a family-owned group who provide, in my view, an excellent public service with dedicated local journalists who care about their community. I think they're doing such a great job, and I'm pleased to hear the panellists recognise the importance of local journalism. I just worry, when we talk about online, the paper in question offer a very good online subscription model where you can read the paper in PDF. They have a good website that picks up on key stories every week. They're active on social media, but the problem on that small scale is making it pay, because I think you've got to, if you're going to have good original content that's written every week, and have a staff photographer that goes to local events and makes sure we have those nice pictures of sheep and from other groups, then you've got to have a way of paying for it and have revenue coming in. And the kind of Facebook stuff doesn't pay, Twitter stuff doesn't pay, and if you're putting adverts on a website, unless you're able to do it on scale, as some of the bigger groups are able to do that, the revenue just doesn't come back in. And it's whether the panelists are open to kind of a dual model where there is some public money to support family-run newspapers with the public good element of what they do, particularly when it comes to training young journalists or covering, in some cases, announcements by local authority, and that you'll have a real public interest.
A very sort of clear a statement of the difficulties, absolutely, and it really goes to, well, two of the points on the list of points that my branch sent in. The first one is to do with some kind of public interest news foundation, because I think the importance of that would be, I mean, I hesitate to mention the Creative Scotland or Arts Council model, because that's not without its own problems. But I think if the government was ever to put money towards, as you've just said, support for local newspapers, perhaps the kind of family-owned newspapers that do a good job, or some kind of not-for-profit model of local newspapers, it would very much have to be at arm's length, and it would have to be filtered through an institution which had quite strong systems of governance, which kept the government at arm's length from any kind of intervention or interference in those publications. So that's why we are sort of thinking about a public interest news foundation. This is basically an idea which originates in the Cairncross report written by Francis Cairncross about the media across the UK a few years ago. Francis Cairncross had a meeting with the Cabinet Secretary, Fiona Hislop, during the course of devising that report. And ever since, really, the Cabinet Secretary has been expressing an interest in the idea of some kind of public interest news foundation or organisation. Now, I would see that organisation, first of all, here we've described it as a government-funded news foundation, but I think in our discussions over the summer with various people, we have come to think that it would be better for it to have a mixed funding model, if that was possible. You know, for it to have an element of government money, an element of money from major media organisations which are profitable, and an element of money from institutions and charitable trusts, which would enable it to have a more sort of balanced range of funding sources. And if we were able to set up a foundation like that for Scotland, then it could begin to develop quite a sort of innovative range of policies and ideas and packages for supporting journalism in a national community of this size, and of course in our local communities. As part of that. And it seems to me that there are many areas in which such a foundation could work, ranging from support for specific initiatives, support for existing initiatives where they're providing quality journalism, and also a whole kind of educational purpose to do with supporting debate and educating the next generation. And as part of that, again, the sixth point that we've made, which is about really subscription models. Now, I think obviously, Oliver, in the kind of situation you're describing, a subscription model is one that could really help to support the kind of local newspaper or newspaper title that you're talking about. If people are willing to pay for online subscriptions to it to get the real sort of edited, well-produced news, rather than just, whatever arrives free on their Facebook feed. And I think giving young people an early experience of having a bit of money to spend on the news that they want to see, and then having an educational package around that to make them think about how they want to do that, would actually be a very important step in sort of changing the attitude of a generation which up to now has just expected to get news for free, and which hasn't really had any pressure on it to think about how it will use its own resources to kind of commission and get the news that it wants. So I think, that kind of voucher scheme could play an important role in that.
Oliver, have you finished your line?
No, it just was whether Peter was, I don't know, Peter looked like he was coming in, but my screen.
Oh, yeah, I can't hear him. Peter, we can't hear you.
Oh, now you can, I think. I know time is tight, so I just wanted to reiterate that. But I think there's quite interesting international models for how you can do this in a way that isn't just the state stepping in, and there's an opportunity to support. I mentioned in my submission that local, and the local can mean for profit too. But I think that local aspect is really important. And it's really interesting to see those local newspapers that have survived are often small family-owned newspapers who have a very, very tight connection to the community that they're in. And I think it's about supporting that, because that has two really important things. It's very important at the local level, but also it's very important, I think, for bringing on new journalists and new talent to come into the industry, so that there's actually a route into an industry rather than, because what's happening a lot now, and this is the kind of the supply side of it, is journalists are going from degrees into jobs in the industry for a couple of years, into very, very unsatisfactory jobs where they're not learning a hell of a lot, and then they're moving out of the industry because it pays badly and they're not seeing any potential for progression. So there's a real need in a small place like Scotland, as well as having the kind of demand side set up, to have a route in for people to have a career, to have some sort of sustainable career. And local newspapers can be a very important part of that if they're done well and their people are in an employment situation that is a decent one in which to work, not one in which they're kind of being pushed out of the industry.
No, I definitely see that, because I think it teaches people an attention to detail, because if you're living and working in a community, you have to get the detail and the facts right. And also, I think it's having to produce that original content, because you know in an area like the one I represent, you can't just copy and paste off of the BBC website, because they're not there covering the stories people are interested in. But the second question I wanted to ask was around advertising, and whether the panel feel that at a national level, at a local level, in terms of local authorities particularly, things like government organisations, the sort of Transport Scotland, etc., whether the panelists feel these organisations seem to have pulled back from advertising in a lot of local papers, and seem to want to put things onto their own websites or try and push them out through other means. And it's whether there's a kind of wider duty on the public sector particularly to try and advertise more in local papers to help make sure that they continue to be viable.
Yeah, public sector advertising of various kinds plays a huge role in funding journalism in Scotland, and there's a kind of historic relationship between public advertising and the traditional players, particularly in Scottish local journalism, which there's been a lot of lobbying to maintain. During this COVID crisis, there was a conversation between the Scottish Newspaper Society and the Scottish Government, which resulted in, I think, £3 million being allocated to maintaining government advertising spending in local newspapers. Or in newspapers at various levels, with portions of that account, that amount allocated to various levels of journalism. So, I mean, there is a historically very strong relationship there. And again, one of the points that we've raised in our submission to the committee is that the Scottish Government is more systematic, and to make sure that when it is spending on advertising, which it is, then public spending goes into all the different sectors of media that we would like to see encouraged in a healthy media landscape, and isn't just monopolised by certain big groups. So, I think the evidence of this pandemic is that it's absolutely crucial to have a fair and well balanced policy for the investment of public advertising in the media, and to make sure that that policy isn't just completely contradicting what you're actually trying to do in developing a really diverse media landscape. So obviously encouraging strong local newspapers that are really doing the job should be part of that. But once again, there are all these issues about arm's length, about doing it transparently and in a way that the public understands, so it doesn't just look like some kind of backroom deal between the government and newspaper owners, which obviously isn't attractive. One quite interesting thing on that heading that's happened during the pandemic is that at Cardiff University there is a community news network based. They run it as part of their academic institution, but it brings together very small scale, hyper-local community newspapers, often run on voluntary effort across the whole of the UK. And during the pandemic, they've actually done a deal both with the UK government and with the Scottish Government's advertising buyers to make sure that some of the advertising spend actually comes to these really and hyperlocal publications. And the Edinburgh Reporter, for instance, which is quite a small kind of local publication here in Edinburgh, published monthly, they received a very significant little dollop of government spending for adverts during the pandemic, which has really helped them to survive the situation they've been in. So it is possible for governments to play an important role, and for governments at all levels to play an important role in supporting local media through advertising. But I think it's very important that it's transparent, and that people understand the rules under which it's being done and the criteria that are being applied.
Thanks, that's the end of my questions, Convener.
Thank you very much. Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Convener. And let me start by quoting that most reliable of sources myself. We had a debate on the 31st of October 2002 in the Parliament on broadcasting and the print media, and it covered a lot of the stuff that we've been covering this morning. And I said at that time, diversity of ownership is one of the things that underpins diversity of opinion. And I want to just explore the tension between journalism and proprietorship of publications, and indeed editorship, just to see where we should perhaps redraw some of the lines, because I would assert that owners rarely operate in the public interest. The interests operate in their own, but journalists, for the most part, operate in the public interest. And perhaps picking up on what Peter said earlier, people want to see themselves reflected in what they read. And I can think of 3 examples in my life where decisive changes have been made. My mother used to buy a Liberal newspaper which was taken over by the Daily Mail in 1964. The Daily Mail appeared in the House twice and then was banned sine die, and she then switched to the Dundee Courier. I, for my part, stopped reading The Scotsman in April 1997, when Andrew Neil, who was the editor, inserted a single sentence in a full-page article contributed by the Institute for Fiscal Studies about the SNP's financial proposals for the election. The IFS were extremely annoyed about it as well, and I stopped reading The Economist when they put on their front page in 2014 a picture with the word skintland. It didn't relate to what was inside. So you can create lots of reasons to stop reading things. I spend £60 a month on my newspaper subscriptions, but I read them all online. So perhaps going to Eamon first, if I may, from an academic viewpoint. And by the way, it was Napoleon who talked about cheese and the poplars along the military roads of Europe in the early 1800s. But there we are, that's another story. Just to ask about the academic view of the tension between proprietors who own big swathes of the industry and abuse their position, I would suggest. For example, the Competition Authority required Murdoch to keep the Times and the Sunday Times as separate publication. But in the recent past, guess what? They aren't. All right, the branding's still there, but they're not. So what role would government play in ensuring the greater diversity of ownership? Because I can't help feeling that would help. Eamon.
Yes, I would broadly agree with that. I think that diversity of ownership is something which is welcome. I mean, in theory, it shouldn't matter, of course, you know that, because if they were following ethically, ethically framed business practices, they would be hands off with the newspaper and leave the editors to go on with it. Every single great case of the papers which have succeeded have tended to succeed when the editors are given their own head, they're left alone to go on with it. I'm thinking of course, the Washington Post in its heyday under Ben Bradley, and of course, the great Harold Evans, who just died in the last week, was meant to go on with it at the Sunday Times. These were great journalists, and the publishers, by and large, stood back, and in both cases, actually backed them to the hilt. In one case, Watergate, the second case to do with distillers and the thalidomide scandal, which I'm sure you recall as well. They were left to go on with it. But life isn't always like that. And, it's incumbent upon people like you. You're the legislator, you're the politician, you lead. We reflect, we give you a sort of a tuppence worth. But ultimately, it's for you guys to make sure that if somebody wants to, take on that kind of publishing sort of venture in the future up here, it's got to be in a way which is scrupulous, and you can't have a situation where you've essentially got a vanity project for a very wealthy owner who can then start to manipulate opinion. But right across the country, it could be cross-border, it could be a group based down in England, could be easily for its own purposes, politically and economically, pulling the weight up here and pushing things in the direction they want to go, which is, is not helpful to anybody. I mean, on the one hand, it's a difficult tension, and just briefly, on the one hand, you do have a pluralistic press tradition in the UK and in Scotland. It was interesting you said your mother liked a Liberal paper, and people often buy what reflects back to them. Confirmation bias, we all do it. It's normal, and I think that can be a healthy thing too. On the other hand, following the more modern American model, they really were very, very strict about ethics when it came to being seen to have clear blue water between who owned the publication and what the line was. And that was why, for example, very rarely over here you'll see the phrase ombudsman never used, where somebody in the paper will actually examine itself. I think this is all solvable. I think the very nature of your question indicates there's a will there, and there's an ethical framework, and there's a keenness to make this happen. But we've got to do it in a very modern way. Going back to what Ross Greer picked up on, which was the most manipulative, and the people who are actually accessing the conspiracy sites the most are people of your generation, and people who are looking no less than young people for simple truths in complex worlds. And there's plenty of simple truths out there for them to choose from. So they are the ones that are accessing, hence the reason why the Brexit vote and so on, it skewed the demographic, it skewed things in a certain direction. It wasn't all the young people, the older people, who should arguably know better. But here's the problem. Do we get any wiser as we get older? If you aren't given the right information, the right tools, what happens? You just end up making the same mistake over and over again. And of course, let's just, if we can circle back to where we began, let's go easy on John F. Kennedy. I'm sure he wasn't the first politician to steal a good quote.
Thank you very much, Eamon. I subscribe to the Washington Post, incidentally, and it's an excellent £7.92 per month.
And interestingly, just before you go, the Washington Post, they are owned by the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos. Who bought it for a bargain at $250 million, and he has been very hands-off. And the jobs he's created are the ones that Peter and Joyce and I are talking about, public interest journalism. He's hired people to scrutinise the very model which has made him all this money. Interesting.
Well, indeed, and the columnists cover the wide range of political opinion, even though the editorial line is quite clear. But I want to go to Joyce, if I may, and just get the National Union of Journalists freelance, at least view on whether ownership is too concentrated to support an effective media in the future.
Well, I think given the industrial struggles of the last 30 or 40 years, the National Union of Journalists very much supports the view, obviously, that there are flaws in the ownership model that we have in the British media, and certainly in traditional newspapers, and that a lot of the companies which are involved are in fundamental line than they are in journalism, and that tends to be the distinction between the publicly quoted companies which are involved and the privately owned, family owned or Jeff Bezos owned companies, which may actually be run by people on whatever kind of model within the organisation who are interested in doing some journalism. I think the difficulty we're certainly experiencing with local news in Scotland, for instance, is that a lot of the local newspapers are now owned by 3 or 4 large newspaper groups, which are run on a very harsh commercial model and which are interested interested in very little beyond the bottom line. It's hard to detect any serious commitment to improving journalism in the way those organisations are being managed. And all of that is very unfortunate, but we are constrained and would be constrained as an independent country within the EU in how much we can interfere with these market processes. What I think the National Union of Journalists would very much like to see governments doing, and frankly I think it would be much easier to do this in the context of Scotland. It's a smaller country, the issues tend to stand out more clearly, and there's a very strong tradition of journalism here, is for governments to begin to support the people, if you like, who want to be the change that we would all like to see. I mean, I know it's an awful kind of new age slogan, be the change you want to see, but the fact is you're going to achieve more by demonstrating how new kinds of media can work with more diverse patterns of ownership than you are by just moaning about the old patterns. So people who are like the people who have founded the Ferret, who are demonstrating a different model, in their case a subscription and membership model, which can really work better, they are kind of doing a better job of showing what the future might look like than people that are simply critiquing the current situation. And so what I think governments should be doing is even when they're short of resources, is setting up structures and frameworks which make it as easy as possible for people with limited resources to launch new media initiatives or to take over old media titles which are on the point of kind of journalistic death because of the management model under which they've been run. And most of the points in our submission to this committee are about that. They're about creating a legislative, a funding and institutional environment which is openly committed to public interest journalism, which sees it as a collective good which governments have got a duty to support, as they've got a duty to support the arts or whatever, and which really works hard at creating legislative and other frameworks, administrative frameworks, which make it as easy as possible for communities or for groups of journalists to launch those kinds of initiatives. I mean, there are so many models of how journalism can work in the world. I mean, we all know that The Guardian is owned by a trust and not by a commercial owner. We all know that the Irish Times is run by a trust and is a really major national newspaper operating a country with a smaller population than Scotland, of a kind that we don't currently have. You know, there are all of these possible models of ownership available if there is a legislative and a sort of and a policy environment which is supportive to them. And I think the Scottish Government really has an opportunity here not to intervene directly in journalism in any way that none of us would want, but to create a kind of environment, both in terms of debate, of institutional support, and of not only providing some financial support itself, but also encouraging other bodies to provide financial support in a focused way that will support that kind of journalistic culture here. And I think by creating a new kind of journalism which does better than these models you're criticising, Stuart, that is the way forward, because that will attract readers and attract a younger generation of consumers of journalism, which is what we want.
Thank you, Joyce. You'll be pleased to know I read the Irish Times every day, although I don't pay for it, and I read Politiken, which is Copenhagen's daily paper. Mr. Google translate to English for me, thankfully. Let me just finally, and I'm not going to go for a second question, convener, go to Peter and just pick up something that happened in Ronald Reagan's watch when he was President of the United States. He abolished the rule for broadcasters to be unbiased in their politics, and built the platform that created the obscenity that is Fox News today. To what extent is that the ownership and partisanship in ownership really at the root of much of the disconnect that there now is between people who want to consume serious media and the providers of media? Peter.
Yeah, I'll pick up on, in kind of following up, I'll pick up one or two of the points Joyce made too. What's interesting in Scotland is what you've really got is very, very hard-nosed for-profit ownership. We don't really care, I don't think, very much about what happens politically in Scotland, which makes Scotland very open, I think, to some sort of vanity publishing that does have an owner that has a particular agenda. So that means, I think, the Scottish media landscape is weak and potential for kind of that kind of hostile environment exists, but it hasn't really, I don't think, been capitalised at all. I think the problem we have in terms of ownership is more of laissez-faire owners who don't really care how they work, they just want their bottom line. But I think the wider problem does exist in terms of the potential. You know, we see it with people like Rupert Murdoch, and especially it does look like we are potentially entering an age where some like regulation like Ofcom could become under much more scrutiny or much more pressure to try and to reduce this idea of impartiality. We're seeing it, you know, and I think there's reasons to be concerned about that. But I think it's important to kind of separate out what proprietors want. So if you look at the British media landscape, it's the big players in terms of media are the group that owns the Daily Mail, the group Reach, which owns the Record, Mirror, many others, and Rupert Murdoch. And of those, I think you can see a difference in terms of politics and interest between the different owners. And I think it is important, I think, to try and figure out how all of that works. And at the moment, we've got issues around newspapers and proprietors and what proprietors want. But there's a real danger of then that feeding into the broadcast side of it, which I do think would be a really dangerous way to go, because what you're going to end up then is replicating some of the issues we've had in print papers historically, even if it's not always as current at the moment, into the newspaper, into the broadcast environment. And as we know, what's interesting about and why that matters is actually broadcast is way more trusted than newspapers, even online. People do trust broadcasters, not just the BBC, but in general. People's views and opinions of broadcast news in Britain are much higher than they are of print journalism. Whereas in America, we've actually there's a much kind of steeper lack of trust in both of them. So rather than looking to kind of to water that down, I think it's needed more now than ever is to make sure. And as a journalist I've worked under Ofcom and not under Ofcom, and Ofcom rules for journalism can be very stringent, but actually are very, very good. They force you to really engage, to make sure that all of your facts are right, because you can't just. It's not like IPSO with the press regulation where you can just issue a mealy mouthed apology on page 50 and get away with it. Ofcom actually has teeth and can do damage to broadcasters, so they're very aware of it. If you reduce that, I think there's a real danger that will reduce the quality of journalism, even outside of the proprietor question.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. We now move on to Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you very much, Convener. I noticed with interest in Peter's submission when he said, and I quote, "The UK government initiatives to help journalism are primarily focused on providing stealth public support to traditional publishers." And in Eamon's submission, he says that data intervention solutions could provide tax cuts for certain digital news organisations, and diversity of ownership and editorial voices must be encouraged. And these have already been covered to an extent this morning. And of course, everyone really talks about the need for a windfall tax model, which I myself have raised, of course, in the chamber. So I'm just wondering how we actually can square that circle whereby we have a situation where we do provide the support required for publishers that have not had significant profits in previous years, that do represent local communities, without getting a huge, frankly, enormous backlash from those newspapers that feel that they should also get a share of the pie, because I think that we would be hugely criticised by what you might call mainstream media if we were seen to be supporting some publishers or publications and not others. So I don't know if Peter wants to kick off, because I'm very interested in his comments on providing stealth public support.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in on that. I think, I don't think it's necessarily, I think it's not necessarily a matter of we're going to pick winners and we're going to lay down, this is kind of we want to pick winners on an issue like this. But I think there is a really interesting kind of case that can be made that talks and actually encourages even larger publishers to think about moving into much smaller community ownerships and divesting some of their interests that are not profitable for them. But I think historically, all the initiatives that have been around media have exactly done this. They have looked to just store up the bottom line of traditional publishers, partly because traditional publishers are much better at lobbying government and are able to use their publications as mouthpieces to make the cases that they want, which is perfectly reasonable, and people do that. But it has meant that the kind of ownership models and the kind of publications that we've ended up spending a lot of time talking about today. I think the ones that we realise are actually really important for democracy, the big D word as well, that we all feel is under threat. Actually, those kind of interventions haven't worked at all. They haven't actually they've not been able to avail of them pretty much full stop. And I think that I think there's a real case that can be made that says, okay, look, we are now going to, large newspapers there's ways in which you can help large newspapers, government, through things like advertisements. You can decide to make, spend X amount of money with large media outlets, which I think is a very reasonable thing to say in terms of reach. We want to reach those audience, so here's advertisements. But I think if you're going to talk about targeted intervention to kind of promote the kind of public interest journalism and original journalism we're talking about, and to support local communities, it's quite clear that hasn't worked. The engagement with the big media organisations hasn't worked. The attempts to try and get that to filter down hasn't worked. So I think there's a really compelling case to be made for trying to do something different, for trying to promote diversity and plurality. And that can be done in a way that encourages, I don't think it's that hard to imagine creative solutions that encourages large media organisations go down that route too. And I think that's an aspect of drafting more than it is of saying, this is only open to you. But I think there is a need to to separate that out and go, okay, this hasn't worked in the past, well, what can we do that could work in the future that does promote that kind of plurality?
Okay, thank you. Eamon?
The thing I would probably is that what Joyce was mentioning, which is there's a way that government can make it easier for new media entities to build and to begin and to build and to launch. I think that's partly the way forward. Sure, I'm all for stealth intervention and support. I understand the concept and I get it. I can see you've got to square that with getting a thumping from the publishers if they don't get a check in the post like other people do. So I think in some ways, we've got to try and come up with a model which actually rewards people who have actually got a plan that is something different from what they currently are offering. Because there's no point in supporting something which is in decline. And when you find out that most of the support by stealth or otherwise is going in some shape or form into the pockets of the publishers, who are quite happy to run that model in a cheeky kind of asset stripping way because that's what they've always done hitherto. And it's a bit like, it always reminds me of Henry Ford when he said, if you asked people what they want, they would have said a faster horse, not a car. Because, and in some ways, that's where we're at, because people are looking at a different generation who are using different devices, different means to access the news, and yet are wondering why there's decline in paper sales. Because the owners, the publishers, are not investing in coming up with new models fast enough to actually replace the one they've got. And why is that? Because it suits them not to. They're making profits. It goes back to what one of your colleagues was saying about diversity of ownership. I'm all for stealth support. I'm all for the advertising and everything else. I think we've got to have a break with the past as well and support new media organisations like the Ferret, like the one that I'm with, Talk Media, where actually they're going out and building it themselves from the ground up. And I see even with my students who come up with the most innovative ways to tackle problems with no money. And they do it, it's frankly better than a lot of the local newspapers do. Why? Because they're actually been encouraged to do so. You go into many local newspapers, as Peter said before, it's all about journalism. They're not getting the impetus, the vision, the enthusiasm and the backing from the top down. And why is that? Of course, why would they? Because the owners are doing quite nicely financially out of the current creaky situation.
Thanks. And Joyce, just before I turn to you, with regard to the Cairncross report, I'm quite interested in that the UK government accept recommendation 4, which is developing a media literacy strategy, basically, and said that we plan to publish that in the summer of 2020. Obviously, COVID is likely to have kicked that into touch. And again, they also supported recommendation 6, which says that the government should launch a new fund focused on innovations aimed at improving the supply of public interest news to be run by an independent body. I'm just wondering, this was obviously a year ago that this was published and that these recommendations were accepted. And COVID aside, COVID only really took off in March. What progress has been made in terms of taking forward these recommendations and delivering them at the UK level that you're aware of?
Obviously, the London office of the NUJ, who'd be happy to give evidence to this committee, I'm sure, about the situation at UK level, would know a bit more about that than me. But my impression is that it's been very much put on pause. And I don't really know how much enthusiasm there would really be for the substance of those proposals at UK level, given the fact that there's actually quite a strong lobby in the Tory party, which is somewhat opposed to sort of media education, seeing it as you know, a kind of subject where people should be studying more traditional subjects. So I'm not sure that much progress has been made at UK level. At Scottish level, as I said, the Cabinet Secretary had discussions with Francis Cairncross during the course of the writing of that report, and the Cabinet Secretary is in the process at this moment of setting up a committee on public interest news in Scotland, a short-term working group on the subject. We had a brief chat with her yesterday from the NUJ point of view, and she said that she'd be happy to see the NUJ represented on that group. And what we would be doing in terms of trying to support public news at Scottish level is really very much pushing for two things. First of all, as Eamon and Peter have both said, for an environment in which new news initiatives which tend towards the production of more quality journalism on a more diverse ownership basis can get some public support. But secondly, for an idea that should be done on some kind of arm's length basis through an institute or a foundation for public interest news, which would frankly, from a political point of view, take some of the flack from the government in terms of any funding decisions that were made about which media projects to support. And obviously the governance and the composition of how such a foundation was run would be you know, a subject of much debate. But I think if you could develop a good, robust arm's length system of governance for a foundation like that, then it could make decisions about which innovative media projects, for instance, to support that would free government ministers, as it were, from the charge that they were just manipulating the media to suit themselves. So in that sense, I think it's really worth considering the idea of having a public interest news foundation that would do some of that work, and I think it's certainly well worth considering the idea of reshaping the environment, the legislative environment, the charitable status environment, all of these other rules and regulations in ways that make life as easy as possible for new media initiatives. And frankly, I think to just add to the more robust point Eamon was making, I think if old news media, which have failed to adapt very well to the changing landscape, don't like that, then, you know, it's too bad. The fact is we need a new, a more diverse media landscape that actually finds the money to pay journalists to do serious journalism. And, you know, if government can intervene creatively in that, in arm's length ways which don't open it to the accusation that it's just funding media bodies to support itself, then I think government should do that. And I think there's the potential in Scotland to do it in quite interesting and creative ways that would make a genuine difference to our media landscape here.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think you know, I thought that was an excellent analogy. You know, don't buy a car, get a horse to try and run faster. I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. But in terms of keeping on with this issue of perhaps having a foundation, you know, obviously there could be some real controversy about who was funded, how much they were funded by, what the geographic spread would that be. You know, I mean, I represent Ayrshire. Would it be would each area of Scotland be able to equally access such resources, because they don't in terms of, for example, arts funding in Scotland?
Yeah.
And what kind of resource do you feel would be realistic in terms of establishing such a foundation? Because obviously it would have to have significant funding. That funding would have to be, I would imagine, long term and not one-off. So what kind of resources would we really be talking about on an annualised basis? Is there any consideration being given as to what that could possibly be?
Well, I don't want to give the impression that we've done any detailed research into that. I mean, you know, our submission comes from one NUJ branch, absolutely no, you know, sort of research or administrative resources. There are international examples of ways in which government has supported journalism in countries like the Nordic countries and in France. There was traditionally quite strong support for local journalism from government in France, and we could look at the scale of those operations and how they worked, if we were going seriously towards this kind of model, and perhaps the Cabinet Secretary's working group into public interest journalism might be able to look a bit more at those international analogies. If you're taking the Creative Scotland analogy, and I think overall with lottery funding and direct government funding, Creative Scotland spends about £60 million a year. I think as a new initiative, probably this wouldn't be anywhere near that initially. But, if you were looking at that as a kind of long-term aspiration for the kind of intervention you were looking at, then that kind of sum could really be quite transformative, I think, in the current Scottish media scene. But it would have to be very, very carefully administered. And as you say, there would be 101 controversial decisions to make about the governance of any body that was actually dispersing that money. But I really do not think it should be directly dispersed by government. So I think having some kind of body to spend it would be almost essential. But even if there were no direct money to be invested, even if you were just talking about a couple of £1 million raised from a range of different sources initially, I still think the founding of a foundation like that could be an important gesture, and I think it could provide an important focal point for discussion about the future of media in Scotland, for the aspirations that we all have to the kind of media that really supports, active and well-informed citizenship, and for focusing, for instance, educational activity around this subject, whether it's aimed at young people or, as has been suggested, at older age groups that might perhaps need it just as much. I think there is a lot to be said for the founding of an institution like this, even if initially it doesn't have much in the way of funding. But hopefully it could also have a kind of mixed funding model that would take some of the burden off government.
I would agree. Something we should take forward. Thank you.
Just very quickly, add as well, there is actually some cost-neutral things that could be done. Like I mentioned in my submission, making public interest journalism charitable good, which would just require a change of legislation at the Charities Office, the Scottish Charities Office and Regulation. So there's other options as well, which I think would be part of that package. I wouldn't want to just see it as the only thing, but there's ways that you can do things that would really help the sector without having to spend the earth.
Yes, I see that in the section 3 of your submission, actually. That particular aspect was very helpful.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We now move on to our last questioner, Dean Lockhart, MSP.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, panel. It's been a fascinating discussion. I think we're slightly up against the clock, so I only have one question, which I'll put to the panel. We've heard a lot about financing structures, ownership models, subscription models, and a new approach to advertising and a new body to oversee the sector. But I would like to come back to the question of local newspapers and what is, from a democratic perspective, what should be the role of a local newspaper as being a platform for local campaigns, a champion for local communities, and holding various levels of government to account. The Stirling Observer in the area I represent is a great local champion and runs a number of local campaigns in this area. So does the panel still see this as the fundamental purpose of a local newspaper from a democratic point of view, or should they be doing more than that core competence? So maybe I'll start with Joyce, then move to Peter, and then Eamon, please.
Well, I mean, far be it from me to tell the editors of local newspapers how to run their newspapers. I mean, really, in a context where you have a viable economic model, and you kind of afford a journalistic team that can, I think running a good local newspaper is probably one of the most rewarding jobs in the world, because you get immediate feedback, you have a close relationship with your community, and you're really doing the business that journalism is there to do. I think definitely, of course, news is important. I mean, it's interesting actually that in the current sort of fragile state of British journalism, quite a small intervention like the BBC Democracy Reporting Scheme can actually have a very big impact. I mean, there are very few groups of local newspapers in Scotland that haven't benefited from that, and from once again having usually a youngish journalist whose job it is to go and report on the local council and to really do those meetings and put in the time, and also to follow up on the news stories that result from a good council meeting, which, as you will know, is a tremendously rich source of news. So there's that. But I think, obviously, because we're politicians and journalists interested in politics, we tend to talk a lot about political news and sort of hard news, events news. But I do think, as I said before, that one of the key roles of local media and of all good media is to try and cover the whole range of life that is going on in an area. So, covering arts and cultural activities, terribly important, the review of the local operatic doing its thing, all the rest of it. Coverage of non-political events is hugely important, local festivals, local bonny baby competitions, as Eamon described it. All of that is tremendously important. And I think that kind of richness of community life, which is not just about politics, which is about culture, which is about sport, which is about local sporting achievements, which is about the local environment, an ever more salient issue really as people begin to concern themselves with preserving biodiversity in their local area and all of that. So all of these areas can and should be covered by a really good local newspaper. But obviously, having a professional journalist cover any of these areas does cost money. And this whole effort at the moment, at this kind of turning point in the history of journalism, is to try and unleash resources that can actually pay people to do these jobs. I mean, it's an area like the arts, really, where people do tend to love their work and they don't want huge salaries. It's only the people in head office that get huge salaries. Journalists on the ground are quite happy if they can make a decent living salary and get these jobs done. And it's unleashing that money from this new media landscape that is the task in front of us, really. And we have to think of inventive and genuinely kind of 21st century ways of doing that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And I'll ask the same question of Peter, then Eamon. Thank you.
Yeah, and well, just to follow up on some of the points Joyce raised, I think there's a real opportunity actually now. If you think of what the kind of conversation we're having today about, like, you're talking about the decline in the press, but you're also talking about young people access. And actually not just young people in general. We all consume far more journalism than we ever did before. We consume more content. So there's huge opportunities actually to engage people, not just to try and keep doing the things that we've done before, which you can do as well, which I think we will want to do. You want to keep the role of a committed local press, the role of public interest journalism is really important. But actually it's an opportunity to teach people about citizenship, about democracy, about active citizenship, about engagement. There's lots of opportunities that can come from this kind of journalistic model, and especially once you take it off the idea of just this thing that happens once a week as a printed edition or once every day as a printed edition. We do some of it at the Fair, but there's things like community development aspects. We do a lot of trainings now increasingly in the virtual world, but in the real world as well. There's real opportunities, I think, for journalists to become much more embedded in their communities, which is what a lot of journalists want to do as well. Speaking to the point that Joyce raises about finances, also a lot of journalists want to be embedded in the communities that they're operated in. They want to be beat journalists. They want to be part of the community. And I think that's got real positive benefits for the community, because it allows people then to engage with the kind of skills that journalists have and to have skills transfer and vice versa. And we're actually seeing it, like, there's a really interesting initiative in Bristol called the Bristol Cable, which is another cooperative not-for-profit journalism. And they do a huge amount of local engagement. They've I think of over 2,000 paying members, but also have regular AGMs, regular meetings, but also have people going into community and teaching skills and skills transfer. And as journalists trying to do original news, that's where great stories come from too. That's where the good quality journalism comes from. It's getting away from behind the desk, getting out into communities and engaging with people. And some of that can be done virtually as well, of course, but it's about that kind of community engagement that is which drives a lot of really strong journalism. So I think there's a real opportunity actually to see some of what we're seeing, not necessarily all as, okay, this is all terrible, because actually people are consuming content. It's about how do we meet them where they are, how do we engage them in ways that they are, and how do we actually as journalists and as people who want to support journalism think about, well, is there skills that we have that can make, can improve citizenship, can improve all those sort of outcomes and make people more engaged with the democracy which they're living in.
Great stuff. Thanks very much, Peter. And over to Eamon. Thank you.
When the government is encouraging people to download an app during the pandemic, we find ourselves trying to work out why a newspaper model, a business model that was invented nearly 200 years ago is failing. Now think about that. If you had £10 million right now, what kind of newspaper would you build? The answer would be you wouldn't. You would put it online and have a print edition once or twice a week if you were lucky. You would also have something that was completely relevant, that was available 24 hours, 7 days a week, and was, as Peter was saying, was also embedded in the community. It wasn't waiting on the community coming to them with news, it was going out actually looking for it. The reality is that most citizens in Scotland will actually know their Amazon delivery person better than they will know their local journalist. Now stop and think about that. Why is that? And are the publishers delivering something which is fit for purpose for the 21st century? I would say no. I would say the models that we've got are completely outdated, and trying to plug the holes in them is not going to help anybody in the long term, or even the medium term. I think what we need is radical intervention, and we need to come up with a new way of skinning the cat, to put it bluntly. And if that involves everything from engaging with the publishers and also encouraging them, maybe both with carrot and stick, actually come up with new ways of doing things, innovating things, I think that's the way forward. I think it's no use just subsidising something which is already proven not work, and be open to asset stripping very, very easily and very quickly under a constant and continuous sort of way. I'm all in favour of actually making the whole model a brand new one, and trying to encourage younger people to engage with it at their level, using the tools that they've already got. It's been proven, Peter mentioned it, it's already happening in places in the United States, which is always the bellwether for this stuff, and it can be done. We're in a position right now to help, but you're the guys with the tools and with the money.
Well, look, fascinating stuff. Thank you, Eamon, and thanks for the rest of the panel for your answers. That's all I had, Convener.
Thank you very much, Dean, and thank you very much to our panel. There's lots more questions I would like to ask, but we've run over time, which perhaps is inevitable when you put 9 politicians and 3 journalists in a virtual room together. So it's been a fascinating discussion. Can I thank all of our witnesses today for both their written and their oral contributions, and the committee will consider the evidence held in private shortly. That concludes the public part of this morning's meeting. I will allow a couple of minutes for members to have a comfort break before we resume in private session. And once again, thanks to Joyce, Eamon and Peter. Thanks very much. Bye.